Good evening. It is good to see everybody. Let's stand and sing Wonderful Words of Life. Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of life. Let me more of their beauty see, wonderful words of life. Words of life and beauty, teach me faith and duty. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Christ the Blessed One gives to all, wonderful words of life. See the sweet loving God, wonderful words of life. All so freely given, moving us to heaven. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Sweetly echo the gospel call, wonderful words of life. Offer power and peace to all, wonderful words of life. Jesus, holy Savior, sanctified forever. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life. Beautiful words, wonderful words, wonderful words of life.
Thank you for getting out in this wind. But I guess for the last couple of weeks, we either get out in the wind or we stay home, right? Be glad when that's died down, but I'm sure you are too. A little boy named Mark spilled his milk during his evening snack, and he thought he would be a big boy and get the mop and clean it up himself. And he started to go on the back porch where the mop was kept, and he realized that it was already dark outside. Well, he stopped. His mother noticed his dilemma, and instead of using psychology, she decided to use theology. She said, "Now, Mark, you know the Bible tells us that Jesus is everywhere." And so he thought a moment, and he opened the back door just a crack and said, "Jesus, if you're out there, would you hand me the mop?" Sometimes we have trouble seeing Jesus or perceiving Jesus or experiencing Jesus. We're going to look at an Old Testament character who had that same problem. His name was Gideon. Gideon's story is told in the 6th chapter of the Old Testament book of Judges. In fact, Gideon was a judge. Now, a judge was someone who ruled for a short period of time in Israel because they had not yet chosen a king. And so a judge would take care of administrative duties, but they also primarily were called to be a military leader to solve a particular problem. It seems that during the period of the judges, it was not unusual for a neighboring country to either outright invade Israel or plague them on a continual basis. Midian was the foreign country in Gideon's day who would habitually come in at harvest time. And when the crops were ready to be harvested, they would just gather them up, take them home. And that did two things. Number one, it took food out of the mouths of the Israelites. And then number two, since it was an agricultural society, they didn't have anything to sell. So it was a real problem. It was a real problem. And God called Gideon to be one of these judges. The only problem is that Gideon wasn't sure it was God who was calling him. Gideon didn't have confidence that this is what God wanted him to do. So what we're going to look at in this 6th chapter of Judges are some principles that relate to us how Gideon knew it was God, how Gideon saw God, how Gideon encountered God. And I think that these principles can be helpful for you and I too, because we sometimes have the same situation. Again, it's always hard to hear from God, to know what God's will is, to experience God, especially during difficult times. So let's see how Gideon handled it, how he experienced God, and hopefully how you and I can experience God. 2 or 3 things here. First, Gideon experienced God. Gideon saw God in his suffering. In his suffering. That's the first blank if you happen to have an outline. In our suffering. Now, it is characteristic for you and I during times of trouble, during times of difficulty, during times of suffering. It is characteristic of us to get a feeling that God has abandoned us, that God is nowhere to be found, that we're all alone in this situation. Gideon felt that way. Gideon felt that way. And we're going to read these first few verses out of this 6th chapter and see how he responded to that. So this is Judges chapter 6, and actually we're going to start at verse 11. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under an oak tree in Orpha that belonged to Joash the Abizarite. That's a hard word to say. Abizarite. If you say it fast, it doesn't matter, okay? Okay. This was where Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press to keep it from the Midianites. Now, a wine press was made to crush grapes, but it was an indention in the ground. And so Gideon was making use of it to thrash wheat so that he wouldn't be easily visible in the horizon. In other words, he was hiding from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord came to him at that time. And let's see what the angel said. Verse 12. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my Lord," Gideon replied. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all of this happened to us? Where are all the wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?'" And then here was Gideon's response. "But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of Midian." The angel appeared. First of all, that would be enough to scare you back into reality, wouldn't it? If an angel appeared and said that he was a mighty warrior. And of course, at that time, Gideon didn't feel like a mighty warrior because he was in hiding. Remember that? He was hiding in his wine press so that the Midianites would not see him and come and take his wheat. And so he certainly did not feel like a warrior. But then he started questioning God. The age-old question, why has this happened to us? And then he recounted how God had delivered the Israelites during the Exodus and following during the wanderings. And he says, where is God? So he began to question where God was, and he expressed feelings that God had abandoned him and his people. Well, oftentimes, whenever you and I face difficulty, we're tempted to ask God questions like that. Where are you? You've done things for other people. Why aren't you doing it for us? And so we ask him questions. But what we're going to see is that really these questions should be directed to ourselves rather than to God. And here's why. Gideon should have asked, what were his people doing wrong? And the answer is they were disobeying God. They were disobeying God. And we read that in verses 7 through 10 of that 6th chapter. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent a prophet to them. Now, if you remember reading the book of Judges, you hear that phrase, Israel cried out to God, repeated over and over again. Because invariably they would face some sort of marauding neighbor, some sort of an invading nation, and they would cry out to the Lord, almost as though, we can't believe this is happening to us. What have we ever done to deserve this? On this occasion, God sent them a prophet. What did the prophet tell them in Gideon's day? Well, let's read about it. Verse 8 continues, and this prophet said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all of the oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. And I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the God of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But now here's the word of condemnation. But you have not listened to me. You have not listened to me. What did the prophet say? The prophet said, you are responsible for the suffering that you're going through right now. God hasn't abandoned you capriciously. God has withdrawn his hand of protection because you failed to obey him. And of course, his words were, do not worship those idols in that land where you're going to be living. But they did. They did. And God just removed his hand of protection. And the Midianites swept in. And now they were crying out to the Lord, feeling as though they were innocent. And they're not. They're not. It probably is true that you and I cause some of the problems that we experience. I'm not suggesting all of the problems. Certainly not. If you've lost a loved one, that's certainly through no fault of your own. There are some problems that come definitely from outside of ourselves. So we're not responsible for all of our suffering, but sometimes we are, especially if we're disobedient to God. Especially if we're disobedient to God. Now, what we see in the book of Judges is that God didn't cause the Midianites to invade Israel. He allowed them to invade Israel and used them to get the attention of the Israelites. And that's why they were crying out to God in the first place. If the Midianites had left them alone, they would have never cried out to God. They would have been content to continue to worship those new idols that they had been introduced to in the promised land. But God used the Midianites to get their attention. I've heard more than one person say, I wonder if God has been using COVID to get our attention, either in the world or our country or in our churches today. I'm not sure that if he is using it as a wake-up call, that it's working. That it's working. I've not seen any great worldwide revival, have you? I've not seen, our churches exploding at the seams because people are getting the message from God, especially when you consider a midweek service like this, and there's only a handful of us here. I know there are a few others who are watching online. But even on Sunday morning, now we had a wonderful day last Easter. We had 163, I believe it was, in the morning worship service. That's more than we've had in over a year since COVID had hit. So that was great. And then, of course, many people watch online. I don't always keep track of how many are watching online. But even if you add up how many are watching online, and on a normal Sunday, not on Easter Sunday, how many people are present, we're still running less than what we were before COVID ever hit. So I don't see any great revival. I don't see people saying, well, that's a wake-up call. You know, God's trying to tell me something. It's a pretty serious wake-up call, but if so, we're not listening. We're not listening. And that's sad. That's sad. Because God issued Israel a wake-up call. They did respond, and in the process, they discovered that God was not as far away as they thought He was. Hebrews 13:5 is a verse I love to quote at this point. It says, never will I leave you and never will I forsake you. And of course, that's the message that Gideon soon would hear God say. And it's the message you and I need to hear God say too. That God hasn't abandoned us. That God has not forsaken us. That sometimes we've brought hardship and trouble on ourselves through our disobedience or our lack of obedience. And that sometimes God uses these things as a wake-up call to get our attention. Max Lucado, very, very popular pastor in Texas and also a prolific writer. In one of his books called It's Not About Me, he writes this about God's presence. Quote, think about it. God never pauses to eat or asks the angels to cover for him while he naps. He never signals a timeout or puts the prayer requests from Russia on hold while he handles the prayer requests from South Africa. He never tires and never sleeps, according to Psalms 121:4. Need a strong hand to hold? You'll always find one in His. His strength never changes. God's strength never changes. Gideon found God in the middle of his sufferings, in the middle of his hardship. And unfortunately, maybe it took that before he realized, as well as his people realized, how much they needed God. God is with us during our sufferings. Gideon also discovered that God is with us during our weaknesses. During our weaknesses. Now, what we're going to see in this passage, and I'm not sure I'm going to read all of it, but God called Gideon to be a deliverer. God called Gideon to be a judge, not just pass down administrative decisions, but to be a military leader. And he balked. He resisted. He felt that he was too weak to complete God's assignment. And so we see him respond to that in verse 14 and following. The Lord turned to him and said, this is God speaking through the angel to Gideon, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Now here was Gideon's response to that. Pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family, the youngest in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. Gideon's response to God's assignment is, I can't do it. I'm too weak. I'm not significant enough. I don't have any experience. Call somebody else, in essence, what Gideon is saying to God. Why does God use unlikely people? Now, not always, but often God uses unlikely people to do His bidding. If Gideon was right, he was in that category. He was unlikely. If you were to look at him, you wouldn't think that he had the mental capacity or maybe the physical capacity or the experience to be some sort of a warrior. But God often uses weaknesses to display His strength. Weaknesses to display His strength. I heard somebody describe it like this. If we only serve God out of our own gifts and abilities, we're going to see only what we can do for God. But if we serve God out of our weaknesses, then we will see what only God can do. And that's what God assured Gideon. Gideon, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to send you, but I'm going to be with you, and we're going to do this thing together. The Apostle Paul discovered this in a personal way. In 2 Corinthians 12, you're very, very familiar with this passage where we're told Paul has a thorn in the flesh. We don't know what it is. Some have thought that it's some sort of a physical malady. I've heard some say it was malaria due to his many missionary travels. I've heard others say that it was failing eyesight. The truth is nobody knows. Nobody knows. He asked God, as you well know, 3 times to remove it. God finally said no. And then here's how God responded to his request in verse 9. This is 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9. But God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's just what Gideon needed to discover. Gideon felt weak, but he was going to be empowered by God. And God's power is made known or manifest through our weakness. And then Paul's response to that was, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, insults, hardships, and persecutions, and difficulties. Now here's the clincher statement. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, he didn't mean I'm strong personally. He meant then the power of God rests on me, even when I am weak. You and I may feel weak. We may feel unprepared. We may feel ill-equipped to do whatever it is that faces us, whatever problem, whatever suffering, whatever difficulty. We may, like Gideon, say, I just can't do it. I just can't do it. Don't ask me to do that. I can't do it. Paul said, when I am weak, then I am strong. God often reveals himself in our weaknesses. The year was 1527. The man was Martin Luther. You know that Martin Luther is considered the founder, the impetus behind what we know today as the Protestant Reformation. That's when Protestants broke off from the official Roman Catholic Church. In 1527, Martin Luther had already been struggling with the official church for 10 years. And there were many attempts on his life. And so it was a bad year. And if that weren't enough, there was a question that arose among his own fellow Protestants about the importance of the Lord's Supper. And so he struggled with that in 1527. And if that wasn't enough, he had a physical ailment that left him dizzy most of the time, and it caused him to experience deep depression. And if that weren't enough, in 1527, a plague developed in Germany, and his own son didn't die, but he had the plague. Bad year. Have you had some bad years? Bad year. And yet, in that bad year, in the midst of his suffering, he wrote perhaps the greatest hymn he ever wrote. It starts like this. A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper he amid the flood of mortal ills prevailing. Now, we don't talk like that. 1527. The word bulwark, we know what a fortress is. The word bulwark refers to a artificial or maybe a natural wall that serves as a line of defense. It could be made of earth, it could be made of rocks, it could be made of wood, it could be a combination of any of those. But it was a defensive wall. So he said, a mighty fortress is our God. And then in a synonym, a bulwark never failing. Never failing. And then our helper amid the flood of mortal ills. Mortal, interestingly, spawns two English words. Murder and mortuary. Murder and mortuary. If you have a mortal injury, it means that you might die from that injury. If you are a mortal being, it just means that you are susceptible to death. Martin Luther was feeling the threat of death in 1527, either by the official church that stood opposed to him and wanted to do away with him, or maybe because of his own sickness, or maybe the nagging depression that he experienced in that year. And yet, in his darkest, or at least one of his darkest moments and most difficult years, his declaration was, a mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. Our helper, he, amid the flood of mortal ills, prevailing. Sometimes we see God in the midst of our suffering. Sometimes we see God in the midst of our weaknesses. I want to mention a third time that Gideon was confronted with the presence of God, and that is in his worship. In his worship. What we're going to see is that Gideon received confidence, or more confidence in God, as he began to worship God. Now, initially, we have to confess, Gideon had a small faith. Gideon had a small faith. Of course, you remember what Gideon is known for asking for these signs with the lamb's fleece, right? Did he do that 3 times? I think it was 3 times. He did that. But those were not the first sign that he asked for. He asked for an initial sign from the angel who first appeared to him. And we read about that at verse 17 and 18. Gideon replied, after God said, I'm going to send you, Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign. Now, this doesn't have to do with the lamb's wool. It's another sign, the first sign. Give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And then in verses 19 and 20, I'm choosing not to read, he rushes into his tent. He prepares a lavish meal, and he brings it out, and he sets it in front of the angel of the Lord. But here's what the angel did in verse 21. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. Gideon needed some encouragement. Gideon needed some confidence. God had given him a sign that he thought he was too weak to handle. And in the process, God gave him a sign. And then God spoke to him after that sign. When God spoke to him, it offered some encouragement to Gideon. In verse 23, for example, but the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid. You're not going to die. I remember he said, I can't do this. You know, I'm from a real small tribe, Manasseh, and I'm the youngest in my family. I don't have any military experience. Don't ask me to do that. And God said, now wait a minute. I've already given you a sign, and now I'm going to give you a word of confidence. You're not going to die. I'm going to protect you, okay, during this. And because of that, Gideon was encouraged. And so in verse 24, here's what he did as a response to that encouragement from God. Verse 24. So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, "The Lord is Peace." So what was Gideon's response to God's sign? What was Gideon's response to his encouragement that I'm going to be with you and I'm going to protect you and you're not going to die? He worshiped. He worshiped God. He had confidence in the sign. He had confidence in the promise that he wouldn't die. And his response was to worship. Now here's a question that I've got, anyway, from my point of view. What if there is no sign? What if God doesn't send an angel? I've never had an angel visit me. Have you? What if there is no angel? What if there is no voice that says, hey, you don't have to worry, I got this. I'm going to protect you. You're not going to die. You just go on, okay? Do what I tell you to do. What do we do then? I said Gideon had something that you and I don't. He had what's the word? He had an advantage in that something happened to him. He saw an angel of the Lord. The angel confirmed a sign by having the meal, go up in smoke and flame. By the way, I've done that on a grill, haven't you? But the angel did this. The angel did this. Okay. All right. And the voice said, don't worry. What if you and I don't hear a voice? What if you and I don't see the fire? What if you and I don't have a sign? What are we supposed to do then? Now, here's my answer, and it's not always an easy one. Worship God anyway. Worship God anyway. If the only time we can worship God is when everything is going our way, and we don't experience any suffering, we don't feel any weakness, and we don't have any problem, then there are going to be a lot of times in life we're not going to worship God. So worship God anyway, and I'll follow it up with another statement. Even if you don't feel like it. You always feel like worshiping? I got a secret to tell you. Don't tell anybody. I don't always feel like standing up here and preaching. I don't always feel like that. If you're a Sunday school teacher, you may not always feel like teaching. What do you do in a case like that? You do it anyway. You do it anyway. And here's why. At least this is my perspective on it. Worship, yes, in some way involves our feelings. But that really depends upon the person. Some people have the advantage of being, I'll just describe it as real touchy-feely. Real touchy-feely. They can get emotional about anything. Grocery store opening. They get emotional about all that stuff. God didn't make me that way. I'm not touchy-feely in any way. Gay can tell you that. Gay can tell you that. And I've used this example before. We were married 52 years ago, and she came down the aisle crying. And I knew that they had to be tears of joy. I don't think that they could have possibly been tears of fear, right, Gayla? She just couldn't imagine. Oh, never mind, I won't go there. But she was emotional about it. I just stood down there, not a tear, nothing. Come on, let's get this over with. Well, but my point is that we're made differently. Some people they get real emotional. When they're singing, they got a smile on their face. They're singing loud. They're enjoying themselves. They might even raise a hand now and then. The rest of us, maybe don't always feel like worship. But here's my point. Worship is not just a feeling. It's an act of the will. It's an act of the will. Well, let me ask you a question. Those of you who still have to work for a living, and I'm in that category, you always feel like going to work? Or did you always feel like going to work? Probably not. Unless you had a huge accumulation of sick days or vacation days, what'd you do? You got up and went to work, whether you felt like it or not. That's what we must do with our worship. If we just waited until we felt like worshiping. My former church in Lubbock, we were having a staff meeting, and one of our secretaries made the statement, she said, you know, I get up every Sunday morning and I ask, and she grew up in church. I get up every Sunday morning and I look at my husband and I say, are we going to go to church today? And what that means is, does he feel like going to church? Does he want to go to church? And she played off of that. You know, she went if he went, if he wanted to go, if he felt like going. You don't always feel like going, but you go anyway. Now I'm going to ask a philosophical question. It doesn't have an answer, I don't think. Do you sing because you're happy, or are you happy because you sing? Now think about that just a moment. Now sometimes you sing because you're happy. Gaylyn asked me this week. I sing a lot to myself, or if I'm going down the hall or whatever. If I'm at church in my office, you might think, you know, there's a concert going on in my office. And she said, why don't you do that? Because you didn't used to. I don't have an answer. I don't know. I don't know if I'm going through a crisis or what. but for me then, the first part of that, I sing because I'm happy. All right? That's true sometimes. But the other part of that is also, I think, can be true. You're happy because you sing. What I mean by that is our actions can impact our attitude. I believe that. Our actions can impact our attitude. There probably have been times when you've drugged yourself to church and you didn't want to go to church and you came kicking and screaming all the way. And you might not have, you know, jumped pews or anything like that. But at least in the process, if you're aware of it or not, you realize, hey, this is not so bad. It's not so bad. Okay. Your actions have changed your attitude. And that's what we must do where worship is concerned. Even if we don't hear from God, even if God doesn't give us a sign, even if God doesn't encourage us like he did Gideon, and then Gideon went ahead and worshiped God, that should not be a criteria about whether we worship or not. We ought to worship God anyway. We ought to worship God whether we feel like worshiping or not. Amen? I believe that's true. I truly do. I believe that's true. During the Holocaust, when 11 million Jews were slaughtered in the gas chambers, a Jewish family born in France were hidden by some French nationals. They hid them in their basement for the years that they were susceptible to being arrested and sent to the gas chamber. After the war, someone found these 3 lines scribbled on one of the basement walls. And here are the lines. I believe in the sun even when it does not shine. Remember, they were in the basement. Number 2, I believe in love even when it is not given. And then number 3, I believe in God even when he is silent. How about you? I believe in God even when he is silent. We're not all going to be like Gideon. God's not going to give us a sign. And by the way, Gideon's faith was still weak. He asked for 3 more signs with that lamb's fleece, didn't he? But at least God gave him sign after sign after sign, spoke to him, assured him he was going to be with him, and then he worshiped God. Well, what if we don't get any of that? What if that doesn't happen? My contention is we ought to worship him anyway, whether you feel like it or not. Whether you feel like it or not. So where do we find God? In the middle of our sufferings. Where do we find God? In the middle of our weakness. Where do we find God? In the middle of our worship. Okay, we'll stop right there. Prayer requests. This is a list that we've been praying for some time. I wish that we could share prayer requests, but that probably wouldn't be very timely with service being online. But we continue to pray for Raylan Williams. This is Bob and Dean Williams' great-grandson. 2 weeks ago they told us the only medical issue he has right now is a feeding tube. Still has a feeding tube. So let's pray that he can he can do without that. Of course, Colton Collette, little Downs baby, and Lindsay, we continue to pray for him. Dawson Anglin, good news about his seizures being under control for a year. And then, of course, Jocelyn, she goes back in June for another heart checkup in Little Rock. Let's remember her. Mary Ritchie, we're just hoping any day she's going to be able to come home. She did respond. We sang happy birthday to her. Somebody said, actually somebody read it to me, that she responded, thanked everybody for the cards, so forth, and the prayers, and then for singing happy birthday to her. If you weren't with us, Easter Sunday was Mary Ritchie's birthday. And then, of course, Mary Allen. Mary, we hope was going to be through in 2 more times, but for some reason she was not able to go yesterday, so she has 3 more, 2 this week, and then finally Monday to finish those proton therapy treatments. So let's pray with her as she finishes that up. I know that's going to be something to rejoice. I hope you celebrate somehow. Okay. Okay. Ruby Palmer, bad circulation in her left leg. We need to continue to pray for her. This is Billy Brazier's mother. Okay. All right. Let's go to the Lord and pray. Heavenly Father, help us to remember that even when we can't see you, even if we can't hear you, even if we aren't granted a sign, that you're always here. You're always here. Your word says, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And help us to look past our circumstances, to look past our experiences, our trouble, and to know that you never take a day off. You never take a nap. You're always here. It doesn't mean that we won't experience trouble. Doesn't mean we won't have sorrow. Doesn't mean that we won't feel weak when we face certain situations. But it does give us reason to worship you anyway. And I pray that you will help us to do that as an act of faith. We lift up all of these that we've been praying for, the children, of course, and Mary Ritchie, Mary Allen, and Ruby Palmer. We ask, God, that you will meet their needs in a wonderful way. And God, I pray that there's still time that our world and our country and our churches would wake up. We might not experience a world revival or a national revival, but God, help us to experience a personal revival. God, I want to experience a personal revival. It's been a horrible year, and it looks like it's going to last a little longer. We see some rays of hope, but the numbers are still, unfortunately, in many cases, still rising. It's been a horrible year. But God, in spite of it, we just trust you, and we love you, and we want to serve you, and we want to worship you. And God, I want a personal revival. I want a personal revival. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank those of you who are with us online. I hope that you join us Sunday morning at 11. If not in person, of course in person Sunday, Sunday school at 9:30, and then worship at 11. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you for your faithfulness in so many different ways, and we'll simply say good night tonight.